Kia ora. My name is Sloane from Sloane Ranger Studio, and welcome to the first episode of our How to Paint an Army series. Today we'll be learning about how you can approach planning your own paint scheme and what that paint scheme is going to say about your army. So stay tuned for some more tips. So this series about how to paint an army is going to cover a lot of tips and tricks around how I approach painting armies from start to finish. So that's going to encompass the planning phase and how I go about painting batches and how I go about painting heroes and keeping everything in sync while also making certain things pop and making certain heroes distinguished amongst the rest, and how I approach something like a monster that maybe doesn't fit quite with the army, and how I bring in allies and basing and storytelling across the whole army. There's going to be a lot of topics that we're going to cover, but today is about how we plan our paint. So when it comes to approaching a paint scheme, you've obviously got a lot of choices. You've got your primary colors, you've got your secondary colors, there's saturation, there's tints, there's shades, there's all kinds of textures that you can create, there's sympathetic colors, there's neutral colors. You've got a lot of options, and so how do you go about starting? Some of you might have a scheme in mind already, you might have seen something, you might be wanting to, emulate one of the existing color schemes like ultramarines or something along those lines, Imperial Fists. But if you want to come up with something new, there are some things that I've learned over painting many armies about how you can create your own sort of tone and vibes. So when I get started with a paint scheme, I'm thinking about a story in my mind. Storytelling should always be your first point of call when it comes to thinking of a new army. When I was imagining my Dunland, I was thinking very basic colors. I was thinking very primary colors, nothing too bougie, nothing too fancy, very primary, and everything is quite simple and clear. There's a lot of sympathetic colors in here, browns and greys, blonde hair, because he's a Viking, of course. But my primary colors and my main colors are very basic. I didn't want them to be too flashy, and I think it works. And when it came to things like texture and freehand, they all fed into the narrative I was trying to create as well. So I've got this freehand on the shield here. I've got this kind of dirty cloak because they don't take care of their equipment, or maybe they've been trudging through mud and muck for weeks and weeks on their way to raid somewhere. So this warrior of Dunland he's been through the elements, and that's what I wanted to create with this scheme. So when it comes to approaching your own scheme, think of that story, think about what you want to say. Different colors will say different things about the army that you're trying to create. For example, if you were creating a Space Marine army and you painted them pink, that's going to communicate a very different feeling to, say, if you painted them black. Combine the two and obviously you get something altogether corrupt and chaotic. But let's say orange. Orange is usually dangerous, but it's also quite vibrant and eccentric. Within orange, you've got something a little bit more desaturated and it looks very earthy. Or you've got something a little bit brighter and a little bit more fiery. But there's always options within each. Let's move over to red. And so in red, obviously this is very sinful and evil when you use red, but it can also be quite rich and bougie. Or it could be very lifelike and vibrant if you start adding a little bit of yellow. Purple again is another rich color. It's a secondary color, and so off the bat it's quite difficult to create. If you're thinking in real life terms, to create the purple color you need to combine other colors. It doesn't often exist on its own, and it's not something that you see in nature quite often. So when you see purple you think, oh, that's quite exotic. I don't see that in my everyday life. Same with pink. Pink is kind of moving into that romantic space, or a deep dark purple where you introduce a little bit of black and it starts becoming a little bit more sinister. Blue is the most appealing to most people. We have a lot of blue cones in our eyes, so we actually detect a lot of blue when we're looking around the place. In skin tone there's quite a bit of blue for most. Doesn't matter what kind of skin color you're trying to create, blue will always be present, along with the other colors, but blue plays a very important role in skin. You'd be surprised. Blue is also the color of the sky, It's the color of water. It's very trustworthy and it's very safe, and it's always quite appealing. Green is a double-edged sword. Green can be life, it can be vibrant. You know, if we move over into this very saturated green here though, it becomes quite eerie. It becomes quite, not spiritual, but ethereal, you know. It's got a different vibe to this natural green here. And then if we desaturate the green, it starts feeling like it's the opposite of life. It's like it's decaying, it's rotting away. You know, you see this a lot in Nurgle, of course, you know, the god of decay. And then over in yellow, yellow is our brightest color by default. It doesn't have white in it. It's not bright because we've introduced white. It's just bright because of the nature of the yellow pigment. And so by default, yellow brightens up our scheme, it brightens up our color, it pops off a lot of surfaces in a lot of places, especially when you get this very saturated yellow here. But then when you kind of desaturate it, it starts feeling very earthy and grounded, and can be a great base for anything sandy or rocky because, you know, it's very warm, and so it feels like it exists in the world. And then we've got our kind of hodgepodge colors over here, and that's of course by mixing all of these colors you end up with brown. Brown is not typically an appealing color on its own. If you were to create a scheme with the primary color being brown, get used to it feeling like it's drifting off into the background. Brown doesn't typically pop, it doesn't typically stand out from anything. It's what I like to call a sympathetic color, because you've got some different shades of brown here. You've got a very rich brown, and then you've got a very warm mahogany-like brown, and then you've got a very desaturated dead brown. They'll say different things, and so a dead brown obviously looks like it's old wood. This could be leather, and this could be fur. What I like to think brown does is it complements what these other colors are doing, because it contains all of these colors. To create this brown, you need a little bit of everything, in different ratios, of course. And so that is what we can think about when we're deciding on what kind of paint scheme we want to use. Of course, this isn't set in stone, none of it's scientific, it's just feelings, it's all subjective, just a bit of a guideline as to what colors can say about what you're trying to paint. So we touched on this just before, but that was saturation, and saturation plays a very important role into the overall scheme that you're using. If you go with something very desaturated as your primary color, there's nothing wrong with that. It's going to create a very dark, a very kind of grim appeal. It's going to be kind of like it's, you know, maybe worn or been used, or hell, maybe it's just the nature of the color. It could be like an army khaki or something like that. Those are always desaturated because they kind of fall back and blend into backgrounds. And if that's what you're trying to create, then that's great. When it comes to painting an army, and you know, whenever I paint an army, I always think of wanting to, you know, maybe win a best painted award, or have, you know, people kind of gaze and gawk and wonder at the army itself. And so when I'm planning my scheme and I'm thinking of that, I like to think of what I can use to maybe offset those desaturated tones. And so when it comes to this guy here, there are a lot of desaturated tones. There's these kind of murky browns here. I've got this yellow in the pants here, which is very desaturated. You know, it's yellow, but it's this kind of sandy yellow. We've got the metals, which have been kind of dulled and, you know, brought down a tad. We've got a grey, which is very neutral and sympathetic to everything else. And so in order to offset these natural tones, I've gone, let's add a red. Red is warm, it's bright, it really pops up. Offset it against something cold and it pops out even more. So I've got blue here, put red on blue and the red pops out. Might be a little bit subtle with these faint little red lines, but red against blue will always stand out. And it's a hot and cold situation here. So hot and cold is another thing we'll touch on. So hot and cold is something that kind of falls across the entire spectrum of paints. You can have a cold yellow, that can be done. You can have a warm blue, that can be done. But when it comes to sort of generally speaking, blue is your coldest, yellow is your warmest, and red can kind of fall in between. The important thing to note when, you know, addressing cold and warm schemes is that warm tends to come to the top. It's the first thing that you see, it's the one that draws the most attention because of its natural tendency to be brighter. So warm tones come forward, which would obviously mean that cold tones recede. And so when you've got these two colors side by side, it's clear to see that this is the one that you see first. This one falls to the back. And you can use that to your advantage. And so say you've got this guy here. Well, we've already touched on this. I wanted that pattern to pop out. I could have made it yellow, but I wasn't using yellow in this scheme. I wanted red to be my scheme. So I'm using blue to draw back and red to bring up that pattern, because we're not looking at the negative space here, we're looking at that red. So in other situations where you could use this to your advantage, say you've got a space marine and he's all blue. Well, what would be a great way to bring out some details? We'll introduce a warm tone. And what's a really popular warm tone on Space Marines? Well, it's gold. Gold is pretty much yellow. It's a little bit of orange, and in the shadows it's got a little bit of purple, but for the most part gold is yellow, right? And so that fits perfectly in what we were just talking about with hot and cold. Gold will pop off of a dark blue. If you were to put gold on top of yellow, you would barely notice it. And so how can you create contrast on yellow? Well, that's a tricky subject, because yellow is obviously the first color you see when it comes to a scheme. And so what can you do to offset yellow? Well, if you've got the majority yellow, then introducing a little bit of cool will kind of play into your eyes a little bit more as well. And so if you've got an Imperial Fists model and you've got them mostly yellow, a little bit of red trim, and that red's going to complement that yellow. It's not going to pop off like we were talking about with the hot and cold, but it will complement it quite nicely. Another thing to keep in mind, oh, lost my brush. Another thing to keep in mind when you're considering your paint scheme and overall scheme of your army is focal points. And so in this case here, his head isn't that interesting. The interesting part is this shield and cloak, and that's partly because of the color choice and partly just because I found those to be the most interesting parts. And so when you're looking at your models and when you're looking at your army, try and find those places where you want the eye to be drawn the most. If it's a Space Marine, maybe it's his gun or it's his helmet. If it's a Stormcast Eternal, maybe it's his fancy weapon or his really over-the-top crown piece or something like that. But find that part of the model that you want people to be drawn to and consider that hot and cold, saturation, desaturation, bright and dark, all those things, combine them together and consider that to be where you want people to be drawn to. It's not always about making his head a different color, but you can frame it. And so here I've got this framing of red, I've got the brown here to offset the blue there, and so I'm kind of pulling your eye around to places where I want you to look. And this can be done on any miniature. It's just about deciding where you want your viewer to look at the model and where you want their eyes to move. And so I don't want you to look at his feet, and so I've made those brown. I'm not too fussed about the handle of this sword here, so I've made it brown. Here, if I really want his knee to be the first thing you look at, that could have been like gold or something. I really want these three little kind of cresty things here to be the most eye-catching part. Could make them a bright steel or something like that. And like I said before, when it came to his shield, that was my consideration. I wanted this to be the thing that that the viewer looked at the most. So I've got this big bright gold piece here, I've got this red pattern offset on a blue background, and I've got this red cape to kind of draw your eye into this. It's just a bit of a shame that the most interesting parts on this guy are on his back, not his front. But you know, like I said, these little things here could have been the most eye-grabbing part of the miniature, and they could be bright yellow or something like that, or bright gold. Remembering that warm, bright colors come first, and so maybe using those to draw attention to the parts of the model you want your audience to look at. Now, when this translates to an army, it's quite different. You've got lots of things to consider when you've got an entire army. You've got different sizes, different shapes, different weapons, different size bases, different sizes in general. You've got a lot of different things going on, and so when it comes to your scheme, how can you make that transfer across everything? In this Dunland army that I'm building, I have the warriors, these kind of medium armored guys, sword and board, or axe and board in his case. So here is another one of the sculpts here. He's primed black, so it's a little bit hard to see. So he's got fur on his back, he's got his shield, He's got his chainmail armor and he's got an axe and some braids. In the case of this guy, however, he's far less interesting. He's a wildman. He's got some raggedy clothes. He's got a bald head. He's got a machete-like weapon, and he's just got lots of little wraps around his feet and arms. So he doesn't have a lot going on. And then we've got the elites, which are these huskarls. So he's got a big old axe with a nice kind of focal point towards the axe head here. He's got a big cape on his back, got a bit of cloth and a little bit of fur over top. Well, lots of fur really. It's like a full-on bear's back, jeepers. But again, you know, he's quite similar to the warrior. But how do we distinguish the elite from the warrior? And then in the case of this guy, well, he's a hero. He's unique amongst all of them. He's got a different pose. He's got some different kind of different axes. He's got a ponytail going on. He's not wearing a helmet like most of the rest. He's got a lot more skin. So he's got his badass shirtless armor. You know, he's just wearing pants and 2 axes because he's badass. And then we've got cavalry. And well, cavalry is just a warrior on top, but we've got another thing to consider because we've got a big old body underneath him. Yeah, he's just a big old horse underneath him. He's going to take up a lot of your eye. He's bigger. He's got a bigger base. So there's another thing to consider altogether. So we've got different things to consider. So how do we create a scheme that can be used amongst all of those things and translate across everything and still look cohesive, but also still give a little bit of variety? And so again, I'm going to come back to this guy. I've got my colors here: red, blue, and yellow are my 3 kind of key colors. Well, that's really convenient for me because within blue, red, and yellow you can kind of create everything. You can branch out into green, you can branch out into purple or into orange, anything you want. The key thing to do though when it comes to making an army is to keep traces of those colors in the scheme. We want to keep probably the red or the blue, and we'll use the yellow to maybe mix into those 2 colors. So we'll be creating a bit of greens and a little bit of oranges to complement the scheme that we're using. And so maybe the hero could have a little touch of green, or he could have a little bit more of an orange cape, and that'll set him apart from the rest of the troops. But he won't be, you know, he won't be something completely different altogether. We'll still have traces of the red and we'll still have traces of the blue. He'll just have something unique. When it comes to the elites, again, we can do the same thing. Maybe we'll even just swap out the color of the capes, something like that. And you can do this to your entire army. When it comes to picking your scheme, just keep that in mind, that you might be painting a lot of different things, and so how does that scheme and what you're doing translate to all of those things? If you've got lots of sword and board troops and you're drawing a lot of attention to the shield, well, what happens when it comes to a hero who doesn't have a shield? Is it just lost? Do you not have a plan? We do have a plan because we've got our color scheme. And so it's a good kind of crutch to fall back on and look at the colors that we pick to start with to reflect across all of the army. Okay, so when it comes to actually putting this into practice, I'm going to quickly go through this guy and then I'll base up the rest of them in super fast, speedy, fast forward action. So we've got our warrior here. What we were saying before, we want a shield to be a bit of a focal point, so that's going to be our warm color. We've also got our cape, which we want to be warm, and then we've got all of our sympathetic colors to that scheme. We've got a little bit of a desaturated yellow here, and we've got browns on the wraps and whatnot. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this guy. We've got our red, so we want our cape to be red. So let's just quickly put some color on here. And then we want our shield to have something eye-catching on it. So we're going to start with our cool blue, and then we'll be able to put a bit of time to creating something a little bit more eye-catching on it. And so it's got these kind of weird dots on it, these kind of bubbles. As you can see when I'm base coating, I'm not particularly fussed on where I get the paint at this stage. Nice, that was nice and quick. Then we'll grab some of this yellow thin it down just a smidge. So this is our desaturated yellow, and this is the color we're going to be using in his pants. And that's just because I don't really want the pants to be a vibrant yellow. I don't think it makes sense for these kind of wild Viking lads to have really kind of rich looking silk cottons, very rich looking garments, you know. Red is it's an accessible dye, same with blue, but a bright yellow, however, that starts looking pretty rich. Alright, so we've got our red. Could probably do with another coat now that it's started to dry. Awesome. So when we're looking at the front, we've got some nice eye-catching colours here. Then when it comes to the shield, well, at the moment it's sitting off to the back, but what I want to do is I want to create a bit of a pattern like this on it. So I'm just putting on a very rough pattern. We'll be cleaning it up later. Putting blue over red is a lot easier than red over blue. But yeah, you get the idea. So we've got this kind of eye-grabbing pattern here because we're using the red to kind of stand out from the blue. There's a nice contrast there. Cool. So there is our warrior. We've obviously got a lot more colors to put on him in terms of grays and browns, and so quickly I'm going to be putting grey fur on the back, because again I don't want that to be a huge focal point. It will be a bit brighter than this, but again grey is not particularly eye-catching colour, so it works nicely for things like furs, and maybe even this guy's a bit older, maybe he'll have grey hair, who knows. These are the kind of stories I make up on the fly. So cool, there is our warrior. I'm going to quickly base up the rest and put some colours on them, and then we'll be able to analyse them all as a scheme and sort of see whether or not it's working. Talk to you soon. Alright, so we are done with our base coats. They've been very quick. You'll have no idea how long it took me. It could have been 5 minutes, it could have been 50. I may have made a coffee, I may have gone for a walk. I forgot to hit record. And, I was supposed to time lapse it all, but I forgot. So, we've gone and base coated everything now. Let's start with the first one. Let's start with the warrior that we showed. So, as a refresher, yep, there he is. There's our guy. I've started to rub off some of the primer, which is annoying. That's metal minis for you. I should probably be wearing gloves whenever I handle these. But yeah, so you can see we've got our red, our blue, and our yellow. Those are our three colors. These are our three primary kind of colors that we're using. Red being the main one, blue being the secondary one, and yellow being a sympathetic color. It's a nice desaturated yellow, so it doesn't pop up too much. Hopefully when we highlight this red, that'll be the thing that pops up the most. So the next thing we painted was this wildman. And so by contrast, the wildman doesn't have armor, he doesn't have a shield, he doesn't have a hell of a lot going on for him. He has just raggedy old cloths and little patches of fur to keep him warm, I guess. But he did have this cool sash kind of running around his body. And so I decided that that would be the component that I would kind of brand, if you get what I mean. We put in our red on that sash, and that kind of frames his position quite nicely, because you can imagine once we base coat the skin and the metal here, we'll have a nice little eye line around his face and weapon, which are the two most interesting things about him. Next, we painted one of the elites. And so there isn't a hell of a lot of difference for the most part on these guys. They have a big two-handle weapon, these guys have shields. And so with this guy, I'm going to make that axe be one of the sort of brighter parts of him. So I'm going to make his beard and his helmet and his axe all quite bright metals. We'll dull down and add a bit of rust to the chainmail here. But you can see how I've kind of inverted the scheme to separate my elites from my kind of axe and board troops. The color scheme hasn't changed. We've just applied it in a different way. And then we have our horsey. So comparing him, so we've still got our shield here. It's still the part that we want the eye to be drawn to. We've still got our yellow. We've got a bit of red trim around the bottom of his chainmail there. The underside is red. So we've still got our dominant color being the red popping up first. our yellow being the next sort of thing you pop up and see, and the blue helping to bring the red forward. The other thing we've introduced in this one is we've got a bit of grey fur along his back here. Kind of blended it out to black just by sort of speckling in the grey. When I kind of add a wash and start highlighting, that'll help kind of give some variation in tone there. But anyway, we've also got our big horsey, and I've given this guy a nice warm brown. I feel like that complements the yellows and the reds quite nicely, but it's sympathetic in that it doesn't sort of interfere or draw the eye too much to the horse. It still keeps your eye on the reds and the yellows on the rider, but it doesn't it doesn't pop up too much more. And last of all, we've got our hero. And so our hero uses the same colours, but we've decided to make a mix for his cape. So using the red and the yellow, we made a mix. Just on the fly, we thought, hey, a hero can have a different coloured cloak. And that'll help me separate him on the table, it'll help my opponents. It'll also just make him look a little bit more special, which is what we want from our heroes. So he's got a orange cloak made from the red and the yellow. Sorry, I'll grab my brush and you can see here. So we've got our red, we had our yellows here, we just made ourselves an orange in the middle. But we've still got our brand in there as well with the red and blue. That is how we approached applying our colour scheme to the entire army. Once it's all highlighted, you'll have a better idea of how it all comes together, but for a good starting position, you can see how you can take a plan and apply it to all scales and all sizes. I mean, obviously I haven't got anything too large in here, there's no monsters or anything like that, but you can sort of see how a sympathetic colour coupled with your bright brand colour can really help everything tie in and keep the attention where you want it. Remembering as well your hot and cold, your light and dark, bringing attention to where you want your viewers to look. You don't really want bright pink shoes unless that's really what you want, but a bright pink mohawk will definitely grab the eye and draw you into the face, which is of course naturally what we're most drawn to looking at. So remember, when it comes to choosing your scheme, think of all of those hot, colds, light, darks, put them all together and create yourself a plan for approaching your army. So my plan here was of course draw attention to the points of interest being the shield and the cloaks. Doesn't matter what it is, just remember that colour can play a really important role in what you're trying to communicate with your army. And in this case, I wanted them to be kind of ragtag, a band of all sorts of dudes, and so I picked 3 colours to use, so I can kind of mix things up and play around with variations on them all. But you can keep it as simple or as elaborate as you want. The point being, creating a plan for your colour scheme is going to help you, create a really beautiful army when you put it all together. And army painting is obviously a huge challenge. There's a lot of miniatures to paint, a lot of time, a lot of investment. And so, sitting down and making a plan to start with is going to really help. On the next episode of this, I think we'll probably have a look at base coats. Base coats is obviously a really tricky part of initial hurdles in painting an army. Assembly is something I'm not really going to bother with. I think everybody knows how to assemble and probably has their own ways of assembling. But base coats, I've base coated a lot of things, and there's some quick ways to sort of help get you through it without the need for an airbrush. I'm not going to be using an airbrush for these base coats, but I can talk about how I approach base coating. So thank you very much for tuning into this one. Looking forward to seeing you for the next episode of How to Paint an Army. Thank you very much.